Georgetown International Relations Association. It is my honor to welcome you to the 50th Annual North American Invitational Model United Nations Conference. I want to start by saying thank you to all the delegates, moderators, and staffers for joining us for what promises to be an amazing weekend. Of course, Naimun would not be possible without the dedication of a few very talented, committed people. So on that note, please join me in welcoming your Secretariat of Naimun 50. For the better part of the last year, these 23 individuals have diligently worked to provide the incredible experiences you will soon enjoy. Their hard work has built upon and added to the legacy of the last 50 years. Many things at Naimun have changed in that time, but the mission has remained the same. Naimun aims to provide an inspirational educational experience, and in that vein, I encourage you all to immerse yourselves in your committees this weekend. Really believe in the goals you are trying to achieve, but also to enjoy your time outside of committee, get to know your fellow delegates, learn from each other, and most of all, have fun. It is now my honor to introduce one of the top masterminds behind this conference, Secretary General Teresa Lowe. Teresa has shown great dedication to Naimun over the last year, critically thinking about how to provide the best committee experience for each of you. Whenever any minor issue arose during preparations, she handled each of them with grace and always looked at a situation from every angle. She has a very intense passion for both Naimun and Model UN, both of which will be demonstrated through the strength of the committees this weekend. Please join me in welcoming Teresa Lowe, Secretary General of Naimun 50.
Thank you, Christy, for your introduction. Honorable delegates, respected moderators, and most esteemed guests. My name is Teresa Lowe, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you to the 50th Conference of the North American Invitational Model United Nations. Naimun is more than just a Model UN conference. This is a value that my staff and I hold very dearly. In addition to providing unparalleled committee opportunities, Naimun also emphasizes unique programming that gives delegates the power to see the tangible differences that they can make. As part of this tradition, this year Naimun is partnering with Action Against Hunger, an organization that runs life-saving programs in over 40 countries and benefits over 5 million people each year. Over the course of the next 4 days, Naimun hopes to raise enough money to save the lives of children around the world. We are very fortunate that the CEO of Action Against Hunger will share her story with us on Saturday, highlighting all of the ways that you, as delegates, can have an impact beyond the committee room. But for now, I ask that you turn your attention to the screens, where we have a very important video to share.
Somebody said, I don't have to tell you things are bad. Well, he was right. I mean, everyone knows things are bad. It seems like we're stuck in a world where we can't change a single thing but the climate. Every time we check the news, we've been hit by a quake or a storm or a financial disaster. We know things are bad. What else is bad? They're crazy. It looks like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore, but we still think we're connected with all the people of the world. But that's not true. People around the world suffer hunger, chronic hunger. 1 billion people, 1 billion of us. Now that's bad. Worse than that, that's crazy. And we've got to get mad. I want you to get mad. I want you to get up right now. stick your head out of the window and yell, I'm mad as hell, I am mad as hell, I am mad as hell, and I'm not going to let 1 billion people go hungry. You tell them.
Die because of malnutrition every year, many of whom are regrettably children. At Naimun, we believe that we can make a difference, and we encourage you to join our cause in ending world hunger. But before I continue, I want to ask a question. Why do you attend Naimun? Many of you have traveled great distances, crossing oceans and traversing continents to join us here today. Why go to so much trouble? Maybe Naimun is a chance for you to kindle connections with people with that same fervor for international relations. Or it's an opportunity for you to spend time with your friends in the great city of Washington, D.C. Perhaps you relish the heart-pumping thrill and pure adrenaline that comes with each crisis update. And all of those are valid reasons. But if that is where your motivation ends, I think you'd be missing the larger picture. Naimun is much more than that. Naimun is a chance for you to step out of your comfort zone, an opportunity for you to confront the challenges of our generation. It is a forum for you to make your thoughts heard. And perhaps most importantly, it is an inspiration for those too jaded to believe that we can make a difference. I have found my reason for doing it. The staff has found theirs. What I hope for you this weekend is that through the crises and the negotiations, through the writing and the rewriting, that you too will find your answer and inspiration. I encourage you to embrace the resources at your fingertips and learn more about the different ways to get involved. I challenge you to make the difficult compromise, to stay focused on the long-term goal, to voice your opinions, to develop friendships from across the aisle and across the globe, to understand the world in which you live, and to ultimately understand yourself. It takes more than a formal suit and flowery speeches to participate in Model UN. It takes courage, confidence, and much conviction to stand in front of a crowd of your peers and share your ideas for how to make our world a better place. I challenge you to breathe new life into age-old debates, to care not about the awards, but about the ideas. Not about the competition, but about the chance for cooperation. We are not a generation of apathy, and together, we can set the world on fire. My partner, a man who shares the same vision as I do. This man devoted the last 11 months to finalizing every logistical detail of the conference. His keen eye for detail, unequaled organizational capacity, and near obsession with prompt email responses from his many Apple products provide the backbone for Naimun 50. Under his guidance, preparations for Naimun 50 were largely accomplished before the conference even began. Without him, Naimun 50 would not exist. It is therefore my honor to introduce our executive director, the man who made it happen, and my close friend, Cody Kell.
Thank you, Teresa, for that wonderful introduction. Before I introduce our guest of honor this evening, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who worked tirelessly over the last year to make this weekend so extraordinary. The people sitting on this stage are the most amazing secretariat I could ever imagine being a part of. They have dedicated more time and energy than I thought humanly possible to ensure that Naimun 50 excelled in every aspect, and I am honored to be able to stand here with them as a part of the Naimun family. But none of us would be here without Teresa. She has, from day one, crafted a vision for the 37 committees of Naimun 50 that draws on the best that Naimun has to offer. Working alongside her has shown me what it means to truly love what you do, as there are few people that I know capable of giving what she has to Naimun. Teresa, thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. I couldn't have done it without you. But Naimun is more than just a collection of people sitting on the stage. Looking at this room, at the 3,000 of you gathered here today, I can't imagine a better guest to keynote the 50th anniversary of this conference. David Kramer currently serves as the president of FreedomHouse, an organization I'm sure many of you are familiar with. FreedomHouse works tirelessly to promote democracy and empower citizens worldwide, a mission with which David is intimately familiar. As Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, David worked in many of the real-world scenarios that will be recreated this weekend in this hotel. In his various other roles at the State Department and leading up to his appointment as Assistant Secretary, David focused on Russian and Eurasian Studies, serving at one point as the Assistant Director for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the esteemed Center for Strategic and International Studies. After his speech, David has agreed to host a short question and answer session. So delegates from the Russian Duma, I hope you are prepared. We are deeply grateful to have David here with us today. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the President of FreedomHouse, David Kramer.
Thank you very much for an introduction, Teresa. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real privilege and honor for me to be here, particularly on your 50th anniversary. And I'm thrilled to be with all of you, and a warm welcome to all of you to Washington, D.C., where I've now been living for 20 years. Which reminds me, when I heard that first song, I actually remember that song. I was well alive. I'm sure most of you were not. So as I look out at the audience, as I look up here, I'm feeling pretty old right about now. But I'm also feeling very inspired because this meeting with groups like yours that really gives me inspiration to continue the work that I do at FreedomHouse and that many other people do in trying to make the world a better, safer place for all of us. Let me just say a few words about FreedomHouse because I'm sure actually most of you don't know about the organization. It's the oldest human rights organization in the United States. It was founded in 1941 with the support of Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Wendell Willkie, who ran against Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 in the presidential election. It was founded on a bipartisan basis, continues to be a bipartisan organization. Bipartisanship, as you know, is a rare thing these days in Washington, but FreedomHouse continues that tradition. It was founded to confront 4 isms, as we call them. 3 of them were overseas and 1 was in the United States. Nazism, fascism, and communism were the 3 threats that those who founded FreedomHouse felt we needed to respond to and to challenge. But there was also the concern about isolationism, which was then a serious problem in the United States, with many people thinking that those 3 other isms didn't pose a threat to those of us who lived on this continent. And I think what we learned from the tragedy and the terrible loss of life in World War II and the Holocaust was that threats to freedom anywhere are a threat to freedom everywhere. Now, we can't respond to every abuse of human rights around the world. We can't respond to every authoritarian regime. But just because we can't respond to all of these threats and concerns doesn't mean we shouldn't respond to any of them. My organization does three main things. It produces reports, including a report that came out just a few weeks ago called Freedom in the World, 2013. We've been producing this report since 1972. And in it, if you look at the cover, which none of you I realize can see from where I'm standing, we rank countries based on whether, on our methodology, they are deemed free, partly free, or not free. We also produce reports that measure freedom of the press. We have a new survey that looks at internet freedom around the world. And we also look at specific parts of the world, including Eurasia and East Central Europe. The other activity, the second part of what we do, is programs. We analyze the situation and the threats to freedom and human rights around the world, but then we actually try to do something about it. We don't just sit there and write reports, but we actually engage in programs where we try to help civil society activists and human rights defenders around the world. We have offices in about 14 countries around the world, which means we're not a huge organization. And we pick the locations where we set up office very carefully. And some of the places in which we operate are not the friendliest to organizations like FreedomHouse. In December of 2011, our office in Cairo was raided by heavily armed security forces, as were the offices of 9 other organizations. My staff in Cairo is all Egyptian, and they are there because there is Egyptian civil society interest in having an organization like FreedomHouse and the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, and others to help Egypt through its transition. And yet the authorities in Egypt at the time felt that we were a threat. We were trying to foment yet another revolution. Well, that implies that we were behind the first revolution, which we were not. But we are there to support civil society in difficult places like Egypt and other countries around the world. In some countries, we're simply not able to set up an office because the environment is simply not conducive to having a physical presence on the ground. But it doesn't mean we ignore those countries. We figure out other ways to try to empower civil society activists and human rights defenders. And we never give up on doing that. The third area is our advocacy work, where we engage in trying to raise awareness of human rights concerns and authoritarian challenges to the U.S. administration, the U.S. Congress, with foreign governments, international organizations, including most notably the United Nations, as well as other organizations. Our advocacy work is where we speak out with a very loud voice when we think there are abuses that democratic societies need to respond to. And so these three areas, our analysis, our programs, and our advocacy, are in fact what make FreedomHouse unique from other organizations, because no other human rights and democracy organization engages in those three areas. At the root of what we do is the belief that the nature of regimes and governments and societies matters enormously. After all, while democracies don't always agree with each other, if you remember, maybe some of you are too young, back in 2003, there was a huge debate over the war in Iraq, where some of the United States' closest allies disagreed with the war in that country. But democracies don't go to war with each other. And that's why it's critically important to try to promote democracy, respect the human rights, and freedom around the world, because while we may not always agree with each other, the world will in fact be a much safer, more stable place. Authoritarian regimes try to block the very kind of work that we do, and the kind of work that you're trying to do. They view the spread of freedom and respect for human rights as a threat to their future. And if authoritarian regimes, and I have some specific ones in mind, Russia, China, Iran, Syria, Zimbabwe, the list can go on and on. Unfortunately, there's a pretty long list of countries here that are ranked as not free. Those countries, those governments, those regimes view the spread of freedom as a threat. And not only do they try to block democracy and democratic development within their own borders, but in many cases, particularly with the cases of Russia and China, they try to block the spread of freedom into other countries. And so you see these regimes try to undermine the stability of some of their neighbors and try to keep these countries from moving in a more democratic direction. That, too, is a challenge to which we need to respond. They try to block efforts in multilateral institutions, such as the United Nations, where for several times, Russia and China have blocked resolutions on Syria. The death count in Syria, for those of you who have not heard the latest number this week, is approaching 70,000 people. And yet, Russia and China do not want the international community to do anything about it. They want Assad to stay in power because they fear that if Assad falls from power, it might cause a domino effect and they might be next. We, unfortunately, in the democratic community of nations, allow Russia and China to dictate the international agenda by using their UN veto. We have to be more creative in figuring out ways to work around Russia and China if they block us from doing the right thing. Now, in the Freedom of the World report that we came out with, there are three main themes that we stress here. The first is that the volatility in the Middle East and North African region continues. And no one should be surprised by that. It is, after all, only 2 years since the revolution in Tunisia sparked an awakening where people in Libya, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Syria, and other countries in the region demanded dignity and respect. They wanted respect for their human rights. They wanted respect for their ability to earn a living. They were fed up with corrupt authoritarian regimes. And I would argue that events of 2 years ago were as monumental as events we saw in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down and in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The second main point is the decline of freedom, political rights, and civil liberties in the Eurasia region. And here I'm talking, I don't like to use the term former Soviet Union. I think after 20 years of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we shouldn't be describing countries what they used to be. We should be describing them now. Eurasia is not a perfect term, but it captures those countries. And I don't include the Baltic states in that category. But we are seeing the real decline in political rights and civil liberties in Eurasia. And particularly for European countries, that should be a major concern. And lastly, as I mentioned, we see continued pushback by authoritarian regimes around the world that is not met with a similar response by democratic countries. In the course of last year, according to our report, for the 7th straight year, there were more countries that suffered declines in political rights and civil liberties than endured gains. 16 countries saw gains in their scores in political rights and civil liberties. 28 countries registered declines. In our measurement, 46% of the world's population lives in free countries. 3% lives in partly free countries and 24% in not free. A large chunk of that not free comes from the 1.3 billion people who live in China. Now, over the past 5 years, the greatest gains were made in the Asia-Pacific region, but also in the Middle East and North Africa. And the most pronounced declines beyond Eurasia were in sub-Saharan Africa. The Middle East, as I mentioned, and North Africa was still the most volatile. But I would argue it is much too premature to write off the movements that we saw 2 years ago and to declare the Middle East hopeless. It takes years, if not decades and generations, for societies that have never lived under freedom to move in a more stable democratic direction. If you look at countries in East Central Europe, there were people alive in those countries before World War II who knew what it was like to live in a free society. If you look at the Eurasian countries, by contrast, they never experienced freedom. Similarly, in Middle East and North Africa, you have people who have never lived in a free society. And so one should not have unreasonable expectations that Egypt or Libya are going to turn into democracies overnight. We have to remind ourselves to be patient and to help these societies go through this transition. In the recorded year before, Tunisia experienced the greatest gain in political rights and civil liberties. And the concern we had in our latest report was that Tunisia would register a significant decline. It hasn't. We should not take for granted that the situation in Tunisia, although recently has gotten more unstable, has remained more or less steady. Libya, a country that, for most Americans at least, was known for the terrible tragedy of September 11th last year with the attack on the U.S. mission and the murder of 4 Americans, including the U.S. ambassador. Libya, in our rankings on political rights and civil liberties, registered the strongest gains and the largest increases of any country in our survey. We have to be careful not to get too bogged down and distracted by the headlines that we see in the papers, which tend to focus on the negative and overlook the fact that Tunisia, and Libya, and Egypt, and hopefully one day soon Syria, are much better without leaders like Ben Ali, Gaddafi, Mubarak, and Assad. As long as those leaders were still in power, there was a guarantee that Tunisians and Libyans and Egyptians would never move in a more democratic, free direction. With their removal from power, there's no guarantee that they'll move in a democratic direction, but for the first time, Tunisians and Libyans and Egyptians have the opportunity and hope to move in a more democratic direction. It also, by the way, is, I think, insulting when people say, well, the easy part was to get rid of these leaders. If it was so easy, why did it take decades to remove them? It's a critical first step, but there's absolutely a long way to go. Removing these leaders is step one, and there are many steps to follow. The future of the Middle East, I would argue, will depend on the success of Egypt in particular. A country with a population of 84 million, the most influential in the region, in a country going through real turmoil. And as I mentioned with the experience FreedomHouse has had in Egypt, we have felt firsthand the difficulties that country is going through. But we should not automatically assume that Muslim countries are incapable of moving in a democratic direction. That's a discriminatory and racist view that I would argue is unacceptable. The desire to live in a free society is universal. Everyone wants that if they're aware that it's a possibility. We should never assume that societies are doomed to live in authoritarian regimes. But we should also not assume that the path to democratic development follows a linear path. There is no model. Every country is going to pursue its own unique course. What we need to do is to be there to help as civil society activists and human rights defenders, and even in some cases, progressive governments need the help that we can provide. I focused on the Middle East quite a bit. I want to turn back to Russia. Freedom House released a special report on Russia last week. that focuses on the challenges posed by the Putin regime. In our view, developments since Vladimir Putin returned to power as president last May have been the worst decline in Russia's democracy and human rights since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Across the board, we have seen measures to crack down on NGOs, on opposition figures, on civil society. An opposition figure who was in neighboring Ukraine seeking asylum from a UN agency was kidnapped by Russian security forces, forced back to Russia, tortured, and is still in jail. Stuff like that should not be acceptable. And when we say things are not acceptable, we simply shouldn't wag our finger and offer rhetoric. We should have consequences for regimes that engage in unacceptable behavior. And that's why I and Freedom House were very involved in promoting the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, which was a measure passed by the U.S. Congress late last year and signed by the President that imposes a visa ban and asset freeze on Russian officials involved in gross human rights abuses. The reaction of Russian officials was a little ridiculous. If you recall, the Russian parliament passed legislation that banned the adoption of Russian orphans by Americans. Russia's response to a targeted measure by the United States to go after officials involved in human rights abuses was to punish their own children by denying them an opportunity to live a better life in the United States. That too should be unacceptable. China is another example where China has gone through massive change. You compare China today to 1979, it's a totally different country. But we should not mistake the economic liberalization that we have seen in China with a political liberalization. The Chinese Communist Party is still very much intent on maintaining control of the situation. And China, too, in our report, is deemed not free. Lastly, Syria. I mentioned the number of people who have been killed by the Assad regime. As I mentioned, 70,000 is a number that I would think is unacceptable. The international community is either unable or unwilling to step in and support those states fighting for democracy. We have a responsibility to act against authoritarian challenges. One of the greatest agents for the fight against repression is the energy and independence of citizen activists, especially youth groups like yours. And that's why we argue it's critically important for the United States and all other democratic societies around the world to bolster and protect these activists if they want to see an expansion of freedom around the world, which I would argue is in the interest of everyone, everywhere. Thank you.
interested about your comment on Tunisia. It seems like there has been repression recently, especially with the Ennahda party and the problem with the Libyan embassy and Tunisia holding back the perpetrators of the assault. I was wondering if you could comment on these rankings.
We have an office in Tunisia. We actually have not encountered problems in Tunisia compared to those we've encountered in Egypt. Tunisia is a country that has been having significant difficulty in the past few weeks. An opposition figure was assassinated last week, and we've seen significant protests over that assassination. There were labor protests just in the past few weeks. Tunisia, however, does have the benefit of it tends to be a more homogeneous society. And one of the things that did at least happen under Ben Ali when he was in power was that Tunisia did move forward on economic development. But Tunisia is a small country in the region. And as you indicated, what happens in its neighbors will have spillover effects throughout the region, including on Tunisia. The transitional government is still needs to put together a constitution and have that ratified by the Tunisian population, after which there'll be elections held. The expectation I visited last November was that that constitution would be put forward next month. My concern is that in light of recent developments, that timetable is going to slip, and that's something that I think is an additional cause of concern. But the Tunisian authority, I think the Ennahda party is an example where Islamic parties coming to power is not by definition a bad thing. It should not be a shock that in Muslim countries there is support for Islamic parties. It's how those parties behave once they're in power and making sure that an election that brought them to power is not just one time, but that they are held accountable in future elections. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask where you got the basis for your information and your claims, and based on what information and reliable sources you would like to claim that China is prepared for the problem as a threat.
Is in our reports available on our website. We've been doing this for 40 years. Our report is, I would claim, the gold standard, which is the view of many people who take our reports seriously, including the U.S. government and many other governments. I'm sorry we disagree about the situation in China, but I'm glad you're here to be able to express that view. I think if we were having this debate in Beijing, it would be a different discussion. When I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor in 2008, I went to Beijing to lead the resumption of a human rights dialogue between the United States and China. Unfortunately, that dialogue has not produced many positive results. And I blame my government as much as I blame the Chinese government, because I don't think we've exercised the leverage that we have, particularly when President Bush decided to go to the Beijing Olympics in August of 2008. That was a decision that I think mattered greatly to the Chinese leadership. And I don't think we used that decision effectively to try to gain progress in the area of human rights and democracy. Beyond that, it is the Chinese government is one of the most aggressive in trying to censor information about the situation inside China. government is the most aggressive in cyber attacks. The Chinese government is also the most aggressive in trying to control information that comes out of the country. So we'll have to agree and disagree about our perception of China and your perception of China, but I'm glad you're here to engage in the debate.
Just the, I think this morning, there's a poll release that 92% of Pakistanis have a negative view of the United States. So on that note, I just want to just ask you a few questions about U.S. intervention in the Middle East more broadly. You talk about the importance of intervening for democracy, and I think we all agree democracy is a good thing. With a lot of these things, it seems like there's unintended consequences that may not be acknowledged. For instance, like with the case of Iran, the leader nationalizes Western oil interests, and going and topple that government leads to the revolution a few years down the road. And also with our most recent interventions in democracy, Afghanistan and Iraq, those have only further destabilized the region and again created power vacuums that Iran has been able to exploit. So on that note, if the United States is so unpopular in the Arab world, is launching largely unaccountable drone strikes, and there's all these empirical examples that in the past decade it hasn't worked, at least militarily, how can we continue to support that?
Look, it's a very good question. It is never a good idea to impose democracy on anybody. That's not very democratic. I say that as somebody who worked in the Bush administration. The promotion of democracy, however, is in the interest not just of the United States, it's in the interest, I would argue, of other democratic societies, and it's in the interest of those people who live in authoritarian regimes. There's no question that the war in Iraq did damage to the cause of promoting freedom. President Obama himself, when he came to office, said he did not want to advance freedom at the point of a gun. And so, I would argue that the world is better off, and Iraq is better off without Saddam Hussein, but we did a lousy job in preparing for the post-Hussein Iraq. There's no question about it. I would also argue that we took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan, and that the situation there after such a long period of time following 9/11 has also dragged on far too long. But just because I would say that we are far from perfect in promoting freedom and human rights and democracy around the world should not mean that we abandon the cause. It's critically important that we learn our mistakes and not repeat them. It's very important in the Arab world that we not consign the Middle East and North Africa to an authoritarian region and say they'll never become democratic. For all the troubles and perceptions of the previous administration, I have to say that people throughout the world still look to the United States for support, even with all the baggage we had. In the United States, I would argue, at the risk of sounding like a too pro-American, is the leader in the free world, and it needs to act like it. Multilateral efforts are absolutely critical. There's no question about it. The United States should not share or should not shoulder the burden on its own. But it means that other democratic countries have to rise to the occasion. And when they don't, sometimes it is left to the United States. Now, having said that, I think enormous credit should be given to France and Britain for pushing intervention in Libya and preventing a massacre in Benghazi. But it highlights, in my view, the problems in Syria. In Libya, we intervened to prevent an atrocity from happening in Benghazi. We did the right thing. In Syria, an atrocity is happening on a daily basis, and the democratic community of nations is not doing anything. We have to change it. Now, some people will say, it's not our job. That, to me, is the isolationist school against which Freedom House was founded, and that's a view that we simply don't share.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good luck with your talk.
Delegates, please take your seats. Thank you, Mr. Kramer, for your speech. I think that while there was definitely controversy in the room, that healthy debate and the ability to voice your opinions in this room are absolutely what part of what Naimun is about. At this point, I would like to confirm some logistical details for the night. The first committee session will start at 9 p.m. promptly. Please note, however, that General Assembly committees will start at 9:15 p.m. Please refer to the block schedule in the conference guide to know exactly when your committee will conclude for the night. The moderator meeting is at 11 p.m. at the International Terrace. The curfew, this is really important, guys, is at midnight. So moderators, please make sure that your delegates are in their rooms at 12 a.m. And now, by the power invested in me by the Georgetown International Relations Association, I hereby declare the 50th Conference of the North American Invitational Model United Nations officially open.